to YMT220 Economics. We are discussing a new chapter, Application the Cost of Taxation. This is the last chapter of our syllabus. It's actually having a new scenario of knowledge, which is an application type. And we will be discussing within this chapter is actually the effect of the tax on the market well-being or the market welfare. And remember, the definition of the welfare of an economy is actually the study of the allocation of resources, or how the allocation of resources or scarce resources affect the well-being of an economy. Now remember that the best or the most optimal allocation of the resources when we leave the market on its own, so buyers and sellers will determine what to produce, who sellers will produce based on their best price to be provided to the market, and who will consume, those who appreciate the product or the item or the service or the good most. So in that case, buyers will benefit from the market in terms of what we call consumer surplus, CS. That's their benefit from participating in the market or taking part in the market, and sellers will also benefit from taking a part of the market or participating in the market by receiving an income from this exchange process. And we said the official, or it's maximized around the equilibrium. However, in some cases, we have some imposed or levied tax, and these taxes are imposed for some purposes like building schools, roads, whatever public services provided by governments. So it's a source of income to the government. So this tax, whether it is imposed on buyers or sellers, both will be affected, as we explained in the last chapter. Why? Because both buyers and sellers will actually share the burden of the tax, which works exactly as a wedge between the buyers and sellers. So both of them, their benefit from participating in the market will be reduced, and today we will explore it in details. Okay. Now look at the effect of tax. Usually we refer to by effects because it doesn't affect only one thing. Actually, it has multiple effects and reflections. This is a supply curve and the demand curve, and this is just assumption for imaginary a price and quantity of a good or a service. You can imagine any. You can set by your own mind any good or a service. Now this is around the equilibrium. The assumption of a free market, that means there is no tax, there is no interference from any central planner. The quantity produced and the quantity consumed is at the equilibrium. So this is the equilibrium quantity. The price without having any tax and the quantity without having any tax is exactly at around this equilibrium. Okay, at the equilibrium. So now if we impose a tax, what happens? For sure the quantity supplied and demanded at the same time will drop. Why? Now, tax works exactly as a wedge. That means there is a higher price to be paid. Higher price to be paid means lower quantity demanded. Okay, and which means at the same time, lower price to be received. I said higher price to be paid by buyers and lower price to be received by suppliers or producers. Why? Because the government, or in this case, the central planner is requesting or is demanding the tax to be paid to them. So this amount of tax, the difference between these 2 points, will be deducted from the market. Why? Buyers are paying this price, however, sellers are receiving this, and the rest is given to the central planner or the government in this case. And that's exactly what we refer to by a wedge. How do we know the size of the tax? We can measure the difference between these 2 points, and that's the size of the tax. So the total revenue can be calculated based on this size, and it's actually easy, it's not difficult. Now look, we have this size, it's a number that we can calculate between these 2 levels, the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. If we subtract, Now we will get the size of the tax. We can multiply it by the quantity sold or the quantity demanded. Then we will get the total revenue from the tax. So that's exactly the idea of the calculation. Now this is what I want to show you. I will get back to that slide. So we have the size of the tax, this one, okay, T, and we have the quantity of the goods sold or the services sold or the service sold. If we multiply T times Q, then we get the total revenue. So again, the price paid by buyers is not equal to the price received by the seller. There is a difference. That's the size of the tax, and that's a revenue to the government. Now what happens? Since buyers demand less and suppliers supply less, in that case the market itself will shrink. So that means the participation in the market will be less due to the tax. Okay, so this is what we refer to usually by a wedge. Wedge is something that separates between two parties, here buyers and sellers. In that case, it actually reduces the total benefit from the market. You may say, or you may ask, or you may wonder, well, how is still the participation is still there? Where is the loss? This is what we will be explaining in future slides graphically. Now look at this. This is the supply again, the demand again, imaginary about any goods or services that you may imagine in mind. Pick up one, this is a good or a service. And again, the quantity with tax, what we assumed earlier, why it will move far away from the equilibrium to this direction. And what will happen, the price buyers pay is not equal to the price sellers receive. There is difference. The price buyers pay is higher than the price sellers receive. So that's the effective tax in this case. Here the quantity demanded without tax is exactly the equilibrium quantity, and this is the size of the tax. Now look, quantity sold is the other side of this rectangle, okay, and that's how we calculate the tax revenue. All right, now again to the effect, let me just show you practically here. Remember we explained about all those. I don't want to get back to them. Let's just mark these shapes here. These triangles, these rectangles, let's mark them. A, B, C, D. Now, before marking them, do you remember the consumer surplus? The area below the demand curve and above the price, without tax, of course, P1. Okay? So this triangle. Do you remember the producer surplus? The area above the supply curve and below the price, of course, without tax. So this triangle, okay? So now let's mark these areas. We have triangle A, and we have rectangle B, triangle C, rectangle D, and triangle E, and triangle F. Now why are we marking those? What's the consumer surplus? The area between the price paid by buyers and beneath or below the demand curve, so it's A. Initially it was without tax, A plus B plus C, this big triangle. Now it's actually reduced or shrunk to A. That means we have some loss. We will speak about that loss. Let's apply the same concept to producer surplus. Without tax, the producer surplus was the area above the supply curve and beneath the price. So it was DEF altogether. Now with the tax, it's the area above the supply curve and below the price received by sellers, PS. So it's just F. So we're losing D and E. Now, what is B and D? Altogether is exactly the tax revenue. So from the market, what happens? A is the consumer surplus, the gain of buyers from participating in the market, and F is the gain of sellers from participating in the market, and B plus D altogether is actually the gain of government from imposing tax. How about C and E? This is what we refer to by deadweight loss. It's a loss due to the tax imposed on buyers or sellers, imposed on the product. What does it mean? Now, what it means here is exactly we have some area that's gone as a loss due to the tax imposed. Now, why? Because of producing less and consuming less. That's exactly the deadweight loss come from. This is what we refer to by deadweight loss. Okay, CNE. So if I ask you any question about the deadweight loss, now you should know, and you should know how to calculate. It's not difficult. It's an area of a triangle, so you know the height, you know the base, so you can calculate it. You can calculate these two triangles and sum them up. You will know the total deadweight loss. Okay. So what happens? The problem is consumer surplus will be less, producer surplus will be less. The tax revenue there is available, so we have some revenue. That means we have some income for the government, but this is not all. We still have some loss here, and this loss may change. It may be small or big depending on some factors. Okay, so it depends. How big the deadweight loss has its own determinants, and we will speak about them in few slides. All right, but in any case, there is a deadweight loss. There is some area which is not used or which is not benefited from by anybody. All right. So that's exactly the problem. Tax itself is an income to the government, but it creates some deadweight loss. It creates some loss from the overall participation in the market. All right. Now, let's address some other figure. Supply again, demand again. And we have the price without tax, the quantity at the equilibrium with the price with the equilibrium. Then we have the tax imposed. What happens? The price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. Now look at this. Because we are moving far away from the equilibrium, we have a loss. So reduction in the quantity. That's the loss here. Well, in order for us to regain this loss, we need to move towards the equilibrium. But since the tax is imposed, you cannot get back to the equilibrium, no matter what. It's impossible. You can't do that. Okay. So this is exactly, we have the value for to buyers, and we have the value to supply producers, and there is a difference between them. And that is exactly what creates the deadweight loss here in this area. Okay. So this is what we refer to by deadweight loss, or the loss from trade when the tax is imposed. All right. So what determines whether the deadweight loss is large or small? We have few factors. The first one is the elasticity. The second one is the magnitude. How much the tax is imposed. Is it 10%, 20%, 30%, 100%, 200%? It depends. Okay, so it's magnitude. Now, when you go to the market, you can check your pay slip, for example, or bill, how much the tax you pay for the items. You will check maybe 18%, maybe 10%. It depends on, it varies from one item to another, or from one good to another. Also, the elasticity of the supply and demand, elastic or inelastic. Now we will see those. For the magnitude, is straightforward. Now look, let me explain here graphically. Magnitude here, look at this. Now these 2 points, if I come closer here, it will be smaller. If I get closer here, it will be also smaller. If I come to this side, it will be larger. So this is straightforward, doesn't need actually much of explanation. It's just basic mathematics in this case. However, elasticity has its own explanation. Now look, if we have inelastic supply, and you know what it means, inelastic, we explain about it. That means suppliers cannot actually cut supplying or cannot reduce it in the short run very quickly. Okay, so if there is a tax imposed on an elastic supply, what happens? Of course, for an inelastic supply, it usually goes close to the vertical direction. It's very steep in this case. And what happens? Now look, the tax imposed turns to be big in size. Y is like steep, so it takes difference between the demand and supply, large difference here in this case, large gap. Okay, so in that case, this large gap will create for us a small actually portion of deadweight loss. Why? It's close to a tiny area, not like if we get these two closer to one another. So it will not be like a huge loss of of a benefit from the market due to the tax imposed. Okay. Now let's check inelastic supply. Now look, inelastic means its shape is getting closer to horizontal, and in that case, look, if we apply, the gap between these two will be bigger. Now look, the size here again, size. This one is actually large, but the whole size itself is small. This one is as a magnitude is big, but the whole area itself is small. Now look at this. The size will be there, but the area for sure will be bigger. Why? Because we have like a Caesar. If you open it, how much you open it, like between its two sides or its two parts, big or small. In that case, the triangle here in this case will be bigger. So this will be like relatively larger loss due to the dead weight actually. All right. The same goes to inelastic demand. Inelastic demand goes close to the vertical, and in that case we will have maybe a larger, as I said earlier, magnitude, but with a smaller size of a deadweight loss. Okay, and in that case it will be relatively small due to the inelastic demand. And if we apply the same concept to an elastic demand, which is getting closer to the horizontal direction, in that case, what happens is we will have with the same size of a tax, we will have a bigger triangle. Okay, this will be a bigger triangle or more deadweight loss. If both supply and demand are elastic, that is the worst case. That means we will have a very large deadweight loss in this case. Why? If both supply and demand are elastic, well, both of them are ready to just abandon the market due to this tax. But usually this is not the case. If there is a very elastic supply and demand, usually people will not even go for producing or consuming that good. They will find a substitute for it. Okay. So again, elasticity actually determines how large the declination actually of the quantity or the reduce in the quantity. For elastic demand or supply, a larger deadweight loss will be there, or greater deadweight loss will be there. All right. We may think about a few factors in deadweight loss. Now, some economists also argue about labor tax, about how it actually distorts, you can say, the labor industry or the labor market. Okay, in that case, what happens if we impose tax on laborers or the market of labor? What will happen? Well, there are a lot of responses. For example, adjusting the working hours, plus the productivity itself. If workers are not very happy because of the tax, well, they will not be very productive. They will complain, and you can say anger will show in their own productivity. One more thing, like maybe we will think about also the retirement. Well, a lot of people will choose to retire. Okay, this tax they are not happy with the tax imposed on them. They will just go for retirement. Plus, how about some, maybe you can say under the table agreement about some illegal maybe activities or whatsoever with workers or laborers. This is all possible because of tax increment in tax rate, especially on laborers. Here we speak about labors. Now you can think about many applications in your own country. Think about in Turkey, for example, tax about cars. See how the market of cars is extremely influenced because of the tax. There are different types of taxes imposed on car market in Turkey, and they actually place a lot of, you can say, challenges for those who would like to own cars. You can think about it and question about things related to that. Now look at the last part of the deadweight loss. Now we will address few things. If the government is imposing a tax, if it increases its magnitude, what happens? If it reduces its magnitude, what happens? Now look, this is relatively small magnitude tax. You can say maybe 5%, for example, from the price. So we have a small deadweight loss and relatively some revenue of tax like this, like a strip, a rectangle like a strip like this. Now if we increase the size of the tax, what happens? Now look, if the tax size is increased, we will have a larger deadweight loss. Now compare it to this. This is a small one. Now look, this is a bigger one, much bigger one. Now also, the tax revenue is likely to be increased. Why? If you compare it to the strip, is likely the area is bigger here, but up to a limit. If you keep incrementing, what happens? Now look, if we increment again the magnitude, now look, now this is like almost max. The tax itself is higher than the price of the item. So we have most of the benefit of trade will be gone as deadweight loss. It will be huge, and we will have a tax revenue, a small or a tiny strip as a tax menu like this vertical strip. That one was horizontal earlier. This was a vertical strip, and it will not be big actually. It will reduce. So up to certain limit, if you increment the size or the magnitude of the tax revenue will reduce. Why? We will have a smaller area to be calculated as a revenue. And that is exactly what we refer to by a Laffer curve. Now for the deadweight loss, no matter what the size of the tax is, if it is increased, the deadweight loss is exponential. It increases also. So along with the increment of the size of the tax, the deadweight loss goes high. So like this exactly. So the higher the tax is, the higher the deadweight loss is. So it's just like a curve, like exponential, or actually curve like, not exactly exponential, but it grows rapidly like this with the tax. It's not linear either, okay? Now, for the revenue of the tax itself, we have the Laffer curve, and this curve is stating that the revenue from the tax will start zero when its magnitude is zero. It will grow or increase while its magnitude is increasing up to a limit. We will reach to the peak somewhere. After that peak, the larger the size of the tax, the smaller the revenue will be. Why? Now, let me show you again. When you increase the tax size after some limit or some border, most of the benefit from participating in the market will go to deadweight loss. Why? Because buyers and sellers will just abandon the market. They will not be interested due to the high tax imposed. And the whole benefit from the market will be just a loss, a deadweight loss. And the revenue gained by the tax will be shrunk, will reduce too much. That's exactly the idea. So here we will reach to a peak, some max value that we can achieve. After it, if you increase the tax, actually you will not earn more as a government or as a receiver of taxpayers. And the overall income will reduce until you reach to zero again. Why will we reach zero? Now imagine, if you try to impose extremely high tax, no buyers, no sellers, so you will receive zero. This strip will move virtually to zero, just one line. That means we don't have a width here, okay? No quantity to be sold. And that's exactly the idea of deadweight loss. We refer to this by Laffer curve. We usually ask questions about it, so pay attention how to explain about things related to it. I explain about how the tax is affected by its own size. It grows from zero until some certain peak. Usually this peak has its own study. Governments usually study about the best value of tax to be imposed so that they earn and people do not condemn in the whole process. They keep buying with no problem, not to get back actually or inverse the process or fall under this curve, like incline in the tax size or in the revenue of the tax. Okay, so that's the idea. Actually, this is the end of the chapter and the end of the whole syllabus. We are done with this course. I'll just upload your assignment very soon, the last assignment. And I hope you guys benefited from the whole semester that we had with these short, actually, chapters we explained. And good luck with your assignments and final exams. Goodbye.